Hey, happy weekend. This trip is on New Zealand. I was there for just a very brief moment of time. I was a real traveler I was a tourist. I was a real tourist. And I will read some from my journal. You'll kind of understand the difference to me, what it meant. But I was at the end of a year-long trip and I was done. So I ran through New Zealand pretty quickly, not a lot of photos because, again, I was done. I also happened to be done with this 3 week project. I am pretty happy I got 35 stories up. Some of them were testing, so maybe 30 stories altogether. I have a lot more. If you happen to have seen the number of slides I started with, I've just barely touched them. So I'll keep going, but just not quite at the same rate. I will get on with New Zealand. Come on. So this was taken out of the plane, flying in to Christchurch, and then flying over to Dunedin. It was really beautiful, but in a lot of ways I was taking pictures out of obligation by this point in time. I was ready to do something else with my life. Traveling with no clock is a fantastic way to experience the world, but at some point, whatever you do, even if it's wonderful, you just get tired of it because it becomes the same thing. I'd had all I could take of shallow conversations. Where are you from? What have you been doing? Where are you going? And it was definitely taking its toll on me. I left Singapore and came straight over. Well, I stopped in one night just as a layover in Australia, then went to New Zealand, and everything, particularly when you're traveling without any plans, it all kind of gets a little bit exhausting at some point. So I landed in Christchurch, flew to Dunedin. I wanted to get down to Te Anau. I don't know how to say it. So when I got to the airport, I had to find a phone. I had to look for the number. I called. I found out you have to dial the city code first. So I looked that up and dialed the city code, redialed the whole number. No answer. Waiting, waiting, waiting. There were no answering machines. So you just hung on the line for a little bit, hoping someone would pick it up. But nobody did, so I decided I'd just go ahead and go into town. I went out to the airport, and the bus into town had just left, but they saw me, so they stopped, and I ran and hopped on. Then when I got to town, let's see, put another one in there. Whoop. Yeah. I walked from the place that they dropped me off over to the bus depot. There was no coach leaving until tomorrow to the Te but there was one in 5 minutes to Queensland. I still only had Singapore money. I asked the driver if I had time to cash, and they said no. But the lady at the counter had already called the bank, and she was going to cash it right there. So I got on that bus. People are often incredibly friendly. Particularly, I wonder how much more it would be so now versus then when you couldn't plan things ahead of time. However, this summer, I went on a trip out west to the United States, and people were incredibly friendly. I'd go in and I'd ask them if they could tell me directions, and they'd start, and then they'd say, "Do you have a smartphone?" I'd say, "Yes, I do. I'm not using it for 3 months." And they'd say, "Oh, okay." And they'd draw me a map. So often we don't allow people to be friendly, but when they have the opportunity, they really are. So I went over to Milford Sound, and well, one of the other things about going to Queensland was the lady the night before had told me that it was a busy weekend, so I wasn't going to be able to find anywhere to stay. But I got on that bus anyway in hopes that I would be able to stay there. So when I showed up, they did indeed have a place for me to stay. I headed over to Milford Sound later, and it was really beautiful, as you can see. What I wrote in my journal was, yeah, it reminds me a little of Norway, only it's not this. It has this, which is nice, but it doesn't have that. All kind of seen it before. So, word to the wise, you have to leave when it's time to leave, which fortunately I was able to do. In fact, when I was in the airport at Dunedin, oh wow. I called, let me see if I can find let's see if this will work. Nope. Technical difficulties, 1950s projector. I started off with a 1960s projector, and that one shorted out on me. And I'm going to turn the light off for just a moment because I need to stick a pin in here or something. We got a little traffic jam of slides. There's one. Whoop. Yeah, so the 1960 slide projector went out on me. We actually blew the breaker. I think it had got a short in it. And this one is not coming out. Then, let me try this again. I called around and asked different people at a party I was if they knew anything, and then I asked at, come on out, another, wow. I kept asking and asking all of them, different people, if they had any ideas of how I could get my slides to show. And some people had ideas, and I kind of explained why they would and wouldn't work. Aha! And then, I think I got it. I got one of them. And then I kept asking and asking, and one of my friends said, why don't you ask your parents? Because that generation all had slides at some point, and sure enough, look, you have a slide projector again. One of them did indeed have a slide projector that I could use. So there we go. That's part of traveling, just persistency. Okay, part of life. It's what you learn. It's a good skill. Okay, we had that one. And then I think we are back on track. Milford Sound. Yeah. So, over and over again in my journal, as I've mentioned at this point, it's just saying things like I feel like I'm a distant observer, making myself look at things. However, one night in one of the hostels I stayed, there were a couple of guys there, and they were so funny and they were so happy. So they did cheer me up, and that was really very helpful. I got my sister some water at this place at Milford Sound. I had started upon her request, I had started a water collection for her. Obviously, I'm taking slides, right? And for those of you that don't know, slides used to come in these fabulous tiny little plastic containers with a really watertight, airtight seal. So I would empty out one of my water or my slides and save the little canister container and fill it up with some water. And I brought it back, and my sister has water from all over the world. She asked for that the very first time when I went to California. I said, what can I bring you back? She said, I've never seen the Pacific. So I brought her Pacific water back. This is pretty hard to see maybe in these slides, but the sunscreens had little shades on. I'd never seen that before. This is a brand new thing. Let me get that a little better. And next slide. That was one of their signposts, so that was pretty cool. One of the guys that I met, we went out from the hospital and playing around with double exposure. That's not something that you see every day anymore, and this was actually a quadruple exposure. LA burnout. Did go on a few hikes at least when I was there, but not anywhere near what I would do if it were the only trip that I was going to, or what I would do now. There are some really cool trees in New Zealand. That's what I would check out. Another aspect of at the end of a trip, this will be familiar to many of you, is that I was out of money. So I bought cheese, lettuce, and tomato sandwich for 80 cents, but I only got half a sandwich for that amount. I couldn't believe how high the prices were. I had been in Thailand, and it was so very cheap there. I got a carrot cake for 50 cents because it was cheaper than the orange, the banana, or the tiny tomato. Again, that was so expensive. I had been buying full meals. I'd been sleeping for $3. And this was, I bought one tomato that was an inch in circumference, and it was 63 cents, which was just stunning to me how expensive things were. I even had to pay about $8 US to stay at the hostel, which was just, you know, I was really, really out of money. So everything was a little bit on the edge for me at this point. I did a lot of traveling by bus and by plane when I was there. Oh, I think I started to mention this when I was in Dunedin at the airport. I booked the flight to go home. I booked it to leave in 4 days from New Zealand back to LA and then on to North Carolina. I could do that because I had a return ticket that was open. It was unended. You just bought a return ticket. Whenever you wanted to come home, you came home. There was no penalties. There were no fines. There were no fees. That was the whole point of the ticket. You bought a round trip ticket. You knew when you left. You booked when you left. And then you came home when you came home. They were good for at least a year. They may have been good for 2 years. Don't know if you're able to tell that, but all those little brown dots are sheep. There's a lot of sheep in New Zealand. A lot of the country looks like Scotland, and a lot of New Zealand was settled by the Scots. Let's see. More sheep, sheep, sheep. And a couple other things that I wanted to read. I am so tired of traveling and being a tourist. I don't think I ever want to just travel for the sake of seeing something again. I have to have a purpose. I don't want to spread America and Western ideas into every corner of the earth. We are ruining so many cultures with our presence and gawking at them like caged zoo animals. So much of the world is developing itself for tourism and convenience that it's all just alike. Take a jet boat cruise up the Amazon, or up a New Zealand river, or up the Sepik River in Papua New Guinea. What's so different? No more originality and flair. Life's a put-on for show and tell, geriatric style. So, bit of cynicism coming out at the end of this trip. Definitely. I remember when I was in college, one of the women across the hall from me in my dorm, she was a senior, and her thesis was on burnout, which at the time I had never heard of. But what I would like, now let me read one more section of this. Traveling through New Zealand this way, I've been a typical tourist and seen that which was laid out for the tourist. Nothing real have I seen in this country. Can't there be some kind of law that keeps jet boats off pure, clean mountain waters? Everything is so accessible and convenient so that a tourist can get in all and do everything in one quick day. No one has to make choices anymore. Yet what they do is nothing compared to the real thing. Again, this summer I was, on my trip, I asked a lot of national park rangers the same question. I'll do something on that one day. But one of the responses that I got was just be somewhere. That we do try and hit all these places up and go see so many things, when really the best thing to do is just pick a couple of spots and stay there. Don't go to so many things all at once and just try and half-ass see things. I flew up to, I flew up to Rotorua. It smells really bad. It's a sulfur place. I kept wondering if my dad would be allergic or have some kind of reaction, because he actually, I found out later, is allergic to sulfur, which is not the same thing as sulfur. But all these hot pools made it really, really stinky. This is a sign, which I don't know if you can read, but the letters are NCARARATUATARA. That was one area. Then I also took a walk to Whakawariwara, WHAKAREWAREWA. Some really fantastic words over there. All of the hostels in New Zealand had plastic on the beds, and it was very noisy. They did have free phones, though, so you didn't have to look for a coin box, which is what the New Zealand people called a payphone, which you may not know what that is, but it was a box where you went and you put money in and you used the phone, because not everybody had one. I have many tales of trying to make phone calls when I was traveling, because phones were hard to come by. This is a really cool, surreal type place. One thing I want to mention, though, is that in my cynicism about just being a tourist, nowadays there are so many ways to participate in places when you go there instead of just being a tourist. Not that being a tourist in and of itself is always wrong. Certainly done it, and we'll certainly do it again. But the opportunity to participate in a place is amazing. There are workaways that you can do, workaway.com. There are house shares where if you have a house, you can share with somebody in another country. There's an enormous number of websites that let you do that. There's some real old-fashioned ones where you go and you just stay in another person's house. You don't have to have one of your own in exchange. There are places where you can go work on farms, and you can also do volunteer vacations. Some of those can be really expensive. Again, this summer I found several that were not that expensive. I even managed to volunteer to work with the U.S. Forest Service and do trail maintenance work, which is now turned into a job this coming summer. So if you want to go and you don't want to be a tourist, you can always find ways to participate and do things and volunteer in spots. So I left New Zealand, went to Los Angeles. I was really overwhelmed with the culture shock there, but that often is the case wherever you go, and then you come back home. But there's my little kitty cat. He was so very excited to have me back home, as was I. I will chat at y'all in a week or so. Ciao.